Good morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. As always, a totally interactive session, questions from me to Janis and to Fabian, and I hope from all of you. If you want to write your question, please use the Q&A box, and please be brief. If you want to speak, please click the raised hands button and I will unmute you when the time comes. And our focus today entirely on the outcome of the special European Council meeting this week and what we learned about the EU strategic agenda for 2024-2029 and where will we go from here in that discussion. So Janis, let us start with the basics. Why was this special summit called and what was on the agenda?
Well, first of all, it was called because it is part and parcel of the debate on the strategic agenda and the need to have a focus on competitiveness. This is at least what had been identified by Michel as something which had to be a centerpiece when it comes to the discussion about the future of the EU at the end of a cycle, the beginning of a new political institutional cycle. Now, the fact that we have international developments also made them discuss on day one, that was the Wednesday evening, more issues related to the global dynamics, so Ukraine and Middle East. And they also had a strategic exchange about Turkey. But the main discussion was about competitiveness the following day, where actually they had a longer discussion than originally envisaged because there were differences which became obvious also in the debate about competitiveness, especially when it comes to the Capital Markets Union. We'll discuss that, I'm sure, later on in more detail. So I think what this summit showed is that one is trying to identify those issues where there is consensus, where there is a compromise possible among member states. But even in those areas which one thinks politically are probably the ones where there is likely to be most movement, i.e. the economy and competitiveness concretely, we already saw how difficult it is. And I think that gives you a taste of what to expect with respect to the overall strategic agenda, its level of ambition, and what will be included in it or not be included in it. So I think that it is in many ways indicative of what happened yesterday, especially with respect to the future.
And Fabian, following the discussions as closely as you do, both in the run-up to this summit and looking at those summit conclusions, this was supposed to be, as Janis said, an important stepping stone towards agreeing that strategic agenda by the June European Council. In terms of that level of ambition Janis just spoke about, what do you think we're learning, both from this special summit and the discussions around it, about how ambitious it really is likely to be, and also how concrete it will be in terms of the sort of measures that are going to need to be implemented in order to deliver on that ambition?
I mean, I'll really start with your second question, because I think this is what we clearly cannot expect, that it will be very concrete, because as we're already seeing, the moment you start to then get into concrete detail, what does that actually mean? The differences come to the fore. And I think this is on Capital Markets Union, we've clearly seen this, but it is a more general trend. That actually, when it comes to the broad overarching priorities, there isn't that much disagreement. We know what the challenges are. A lot of them have already been discussed quite extensively in the run-up to this meeting. They are going to certainly find themselves again in the strategic agenda. But the big question is, where's the strategic thinking of saying what are the real priorities, what are the things we are going to have to do, and then saying how are we going to deliver those, and also starting to talk about the trade-offs between them, because that is part of the discussion which is entirely missing. It is very hard to see how we can achieve all of these things at the same time. it is very hard to see, even if you just look at the level of money. Where is all the money going to come from to do all of these different things? And that's when it becomes more concrete and much more difficult.
Come back on that money question a little bit later on, but can we do just a quick resume, Janis, before we come on to the central focus of the discussions, that competitiveness agenda and all those different elements, just in terms of the foreign policy side of things. And Janis, perhaps you could quickly take us through this in terms of on Ukraine. The most significant lines seem to be that focus on urgently providing air defense. How significant was it? And is this more a case, this because of what is happening in the US and US Congress? Is it really now all of Europe, all of the world and Ukraine looking to the US at the moment? Or did this summit take the EU contribution a key step further?
Well, obviously, everyone's looking into the decision which Congress will take, where there is movement, and there is hope that actually there will be a decision taken to continuously support Ukraine. But this entire discussion has shown that how much we are dependent on the US, and actually that we need to speed up in terms of our assistance, but also in terms of the level of ambition of what we are ready to provide. Now, the debate of this week and also of this European Council was, as you said, very much concentrating on the air defense and providing more assistance to Ukraine when it comes to air defense. Some countries are ready to do so. Notably, in this case, it includes Germany. And we also saw that the German Chancellor, before the summit, during the summit, and also afterwards, when you watched his press conference, was pushing other member states to provide more support when it comes to air defense. Germany is providing support when it comes to air defense with Patriot, and he was asking that others should equally enhance their effort when it comes to air defense, and that is now. One is no more important because the attacks of the Russian side have intensified, but also because of what we saw during the attacks of Iran on Israel, that if you have systems in place which actually are at the highest level of sophistication, you can stop a lot of these things arriving at your territory. So that increased the pressure, and I'm sure that this is what Zelensky was also conveying as a message when he met them online.
And how significant, Fabian, that it was the Germans who have been criticized during the Ukraine conflict for often being the most reluctant to move forward in terms of the provision of assistance to Ukraine, military assistance, that it was Germany pushing particularly on this issue of air defenses.
I think it is a positive sign that clearly Germany is seeing what needs to be done. Unfortunately, I have to be a little cynical. I mean, is this really news? Did we not know this? I think the reality is we have known this for a very long time. Now, hopefully, this will now lead to real action. But in the end, it isn't dependent on making nice announcements. It's not dependent on making declarations. It's depending on having patriots on the ground, which are actually doing the job which they need to do. Let's see whether this is now followed by swift action, which is also overcoming some of the national taboos which are there.
Absolutely.
But the other positive thing, I think, which is also worth emphasizing, is the relationship between France and Germany, and that there was at least from, I would say, from an intent, the attempt to try to portray a much more common front, much more united, also in terms of the assessment of the situation.
I'd like to come back on that, if I might, later, because interesting also France and Germany on the issue of capital markets union, which we'll come back to also trying to show more of a united front. I wonder if we're seeing a shift here, but let's come back to that perhaps later on. Just continuing on the foreign policy issues, Janis, Middle East, the conclusions condemned Iran's attack on Israel, but called on all parties to, quote, exercise the utmost restraint and refrain from any action that may increase tensions in the region. It seems from developments overnight that Israel is listening to the international community on this, albeit probably more in response to pressure from the US. But was there any discussion on sanctions on Iran? Did that discussion go anywhere?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be cautious and not now draw already conclusion of what kind of reaction at the end there will be from Israel. We see what has happened thus far. So there seems to be actually an effect coming from all the pressure from Washington, but also from a lot of European capitals on the Israeli government, on Netanyahu to be restrained or be constrained in their reaction to the Iranian attacks. But still some time to go. So let's see how things will develop. And I think that everyone is on alert, that the danger might still be there, that the tensions will increase. I think it's also important to note that there is a strong reference in the European Council conclusion on Lebanon, on the situation in Lebanon, and the danger of a situation spiraling out of control in Lebanon. Now, obviously, the country is hugely affected. The numbers of refugees arriving in Lebanon is immensely increasing, which potentially could also then have an effect on the EU and its member states. So it's noteworthy that there is now a much stronger emphasis on the situation in Lebanon, on the support for Lebanon. When it comes to sanctions, I think there is, on Iran, there is clarity that there will be sanctions, but there are some differences in terms of how exactly, what kind of sanctions these will be, and what products might be affected. So there are also some differences among member states which need to be overcome. But politically, there is a clear signal. We will sanction. We are ready to do this, but here the devil lies a bit in lies somewhat in the detail. But I think there is progress in this direction, given that this is one way of putting pressure on Iran, which is an important signal towards Israel, because what is the biggest objective is to avert an increase of the regional tensions.
Absolutely. Fabian, I don't know whether you want to react on that before we move to Turkey, and then I want to really focus on the competitiveness issues.
I mean, just very briefly to say that, I mean, clearly what is everyone's attempt at this moment in time is to avoid further escalation. But I would question whether Europe really can play a major role in this. I think these decisions are essentially taken elsewhere, and Netanyahu and certainly also Iran don't take their cues from Europe. So I think it is right that we're trying to prevent the escalation, but in the end, we are not the ones who are going to decide.
Indeed not. So our third foreign policy issue before we turn to economics, there was what was called a strategic debate on Turkey, and there were some warm overtures, if I could call it that, quoting from the summit conclusions about the development of a cooperative and mutually beneficial relationship. But it said, and this seemed to be a little note of caution injected here, the work should advance in a, quote, phased, proportionate and reversible manner, and Turkey's own constructive engagement would be instrumental. Janis, what should we read into that wording?
Well, first of all, we've seen that there has been a push from a good number of member states, led here again by Berlin, to try to improve the relationship between the EU and Turkey, to put it somewhat again on a positive track. Now, the fact that the relationship between Greece and Turkey have developed rather positively over the past year, although there now are again new tensions. But still, the overall development over the past months, past year, have been positive. So a good number of member states were saying we need to redefine our relationship. We need to use that window of opportunity to improve relations with Turkey. But as you were quoting from the conclusions, this is exactly what they show, meaning that that there are some member states who are much more careful when it comes, much more worried. Also, the fact that they put the word reversible into the council conclusion shows that there is a question mark with respect to whether the developments in Turkey will improve in future or whether we will have backtracking. And then there is something which is important in the conclusion. There's a strong link to the resumption of and the progress in the Cyprus settlement talks. So that makes it the improvement of the relationship between EU and Turkey very conditional on the situation in Cyprus. And for those who are informed about the situation, that signals that it will be difficult to find an agreement with Ankara, to find an agreement with Erdogan, because this is a thorny issue which is still out there. And there were a good number of analysts who were saying, well, if you want to improve your relations with Turkey, putting so much emphasis on Cyprus is not the right way of doing so. But this is something which came very strong from Cyprus itself, but also from the Greek side. So we see two signs here. One, trying to reach out their hand, but being very careful in doing so.
Thank you very much. Let us move on to the competitiveness agenda. And first, Fabian, just in terms of the decision to focus on this issue, rather than any other. I mean, you might think at a time of geopolitical tensions of the scale we are seeing now, that the first area, because it was the first mentioned in the Granada Declaration that launched the discussion on the strategic agenda, the first issue it focused on was building the strategic compass for security and defence. But here, choice was made to focus on competitiveness. Why do you believe that was the chosen focus?
I mean, I think a starting point certainly is that competitiveness was always going to be one of the prominent topics on the agenda. It has been shaping up in that direction for quite a while. There are a number of different drivers behind that. I don't think we should underplay also the global dimension to this. This has a very big part of geoeconomics in it. When you actually read the starting point of this discussion, it is actually, at least in its initial formulation, very much outward focused. It's talking about competing with the rest of the world. I think what is also one of the drivers why this has now been on the agenda is that up to now it has been rather vague. It has been about, yes, we need to do something because we are worried, and European leaders are worried about Europe's economy. They're worried about both what is happening domestically and how European economies are performing internationally. And of course, these are connected as well. So this was an occasion to also start talking about what does that mean concretely? What are the kind of things we can do? And that's why it was also helpful to have the letter report there, because it gave a basis for a discussion of what are the kind of things which we might want to put in that pot. Of course, not to be decided in all its detail at this moment in time, but to start signaling about broad areas of direction.
Can I just following up on that? We'll come to what the letter report focused on the single market. We'll come back to the reaction to that, what they talked about, what it contains. But I was a bit struck that this was the competitiveness discussion, and there is a report we're waiting for from Mario Draghi on the future of competitiveness. And it just struck me as slightly odd to be having the conversation about competitiveness before you've received that report. Is that just, I mean, is there any reason behind that, or do you expect the Draghi report to take this conversation on? Fabian, just staying with you for a moment.
I think I wouldn't read too much into it, also because we have already seen the broad outline of the kind of things which are going to be in the Draghi report. And in general, from my perspective, I don't think there's very much surprising which we can expect. Neither could we expect very much surprising from the letter report. I don't think that's the function they have. It is not about really coming up with new policy ideas of what we need to do. Rather, I think, and I hope that is their function, because I think that would be extremely useful. Rather, they are there to create a momentum to be able to politically say, yes, now we are going to really tackle it, and maybe to finally do the things which we've talked about for a very long time.
Janis, your perspective on why this conversation now, but then crucially, in terms of this, the conclusions call for what they call a new European competitiveness deal. What did the discussions tell us? And the conclusions about what it's likely to include and what's most contentious and where is there more consensus?
Before I address this, let me go one step back, and adding to what Fabian was saying when explaining why competitiveness and why now. I think adding to what he said, there is the political tactics. There is an appreciation that in this area, so broader the economy and the future of Europe's economy, and Europe's competitiveness, especially vis-a-vis external actors, that this is a field where an agreement can be found among the EU 27, where a bigger narrative, political narrative is out there, which the 27 member states can agree to and also convey as a message. And I think adding to that, a political tactical element, if you assume that this is an area where you can find agreement, whereas in others it's more difficult, and that you have a narrative which could play out also in the wider public arena, that this is something which you can then also put things underneath that frame or within that framing. So you already mentioned defense. Defense can also play a role when it comes to competitiveness, both in the letter, but also in the Draghi report, at least what we can expect from it, because it's not out, obviously, will have a strong reference, for example, to defense. So I think that under the umbrella of competitiveness, they will try to put other things underneath it in order to create something which has a certain level of coherence and support, and also support not only from governments, but also potentially public support in the debate about the future of the EU. Now, let's not forget, it was the European Council, which includes the President of the European Council, who had asked Draghi to come up with this report on the single market. Whereas the Draghi report, it's the Commission which has asked Draghi to write the report on competitiveness. Let's not forget this. Second, we now know a bit more about what the report will be about and what Draghi will be asking for. And I think that what we can expect from the Draghi report is something which is potentially more coherent, more substantial, and more ambitious than what Letta presented. Let's not forget, Letta explicitly said, what I'm offering, 146 or 147 pages, is a toolkit. It's not a Bible. And I'm quoting him. By the way, when he was summarizing his report, that was transmitted online, so you could follow what he was saying.
Report.
Yeah, I know. But I'm still with the bigger picture. So I think that what Draghi will come forward with will be more ambitious, and that discussion is to be held after the EP elections, because there is the fear that he might be asking things which might be pushing things in a direction which could negatively interfere in the EP elections. Interesting, by the way, for example, that Dutch politicians have said, we want to report before because we want to discuss it during the EP elections, as an example. But this is not something which EU leaders want. And that shows, and that's why it's part of the bigger picture, that we're still avoiding having an honest public debate about what we want to concentrate on.
Before we come to the content, Fabian, your reaction on that, is this a ducking of the issue because it's felt to be too contentious? We're going to, by the way, in our next EPC update at the beginning of May, focus on the European elections in much more detail. But would you agree with Janis in terms of his reading of the strategic approach, the politics of this, and why it's being done in this order?
I wouldn't disagree with Janis. I think whether it's intentional or not, the result is exactly the same. And I have to say, I mean, reading through the conclusions, I mean, even within the normal realm of council conclusions, there's an awful lot of we are basically going to do all the things we have said before. And it's very much in terms of very broad objectives. but not touching on any of the really difficult issues, with maybe the exception of Capital Markets Union, where they then ended up not having a real agreement. And I think this is the fate which we're going to see in many other areas. But if you read what is said on industrial policy, on digital, on all of the different issues, it really skirts all of the difficult areas which could potentially be explored.
Indeed, we have one paragraph, one extremely short paragraph, no less, more, one sentence on each of those topics, on industry, on research and innovation, energy, the circular economy, digital, social, trade, a better and smarter regulatory framework, a competitive, sustainable and resilient agriculture. It's all in there. It's the Christmas tree, but Janis, lots of nice words, but it looks as if that prioritization that you are both appealing for is not happening. I want to come back on the single market CMU in a moment, but this general approach, it looks as if we really are just going to have a very long list without a real debate on priorities and trade-offs.
I think this analytically is what we probably can expect. There are the differences between member states. So even if you look into, certain areas, I mean, broad areas, in the area of the economy, there are differences among member states, and they struggle to find an agreement. So that is often then the reaction to that is that one is broad, one is more general, one is laying out objectives in very, very different fields, because actually one cannot agree on what is the most important and what actually that then requires in terms of trade-offs. And that's within certain broad areas. If you then expand it and ask, okay, what is more important? I'm a bit simplifying here. Is it the future of our economy? Is it the Green Deal? Or is it defense? When it comes to these kind of, again, I know that I was simplifying, these kind of discussions, we're actually not having them. So the outcome will probably be what you called a Christmas tree list with a rather long list of priorities, and not signaling out what actually is the most important thing to do, because of all the reasons which Fabian was describing. We are avoiding having this strategic debate, and we're doing that, I think, in this case, on purpose.
Yeah. Let me come to the most contentious issue at this event. Oh, and just before we do, a question from our audience. Peter Bocek says, green, the word green appears 2 times. The word climate 4 times. Competitiveness 21 times. Could that indicate some of the rebalancing he says, referring to himself, that we hope for? Do you read this as a rebalancing, Fabian? Or is it simply that was not where the focus was this time, and we'll see more of the word green and climate later on?
Well, I think what we are seeing now is a more general trend. This is not accidental. It's not that we simply focused on something else. I think what is in part behind this is that leaders, and also particularly the European Commission, believe that the Green Deal has been done. We have delivered what was necessary there. Certainly, when you talk to people, they talk about 90% of the legislation having gone through. So in a way, it's the tick behind the green agenda. Of course, that doesn't mean it will go away. It will still be in the background. But politically, I think there's more behind it than that. I think what we are actually seeing is a debate which is about, can we achieve the really ambitious green targets? Can we achieve the transformation, the structural transformation which is needed without negatively affecting competitiveness? And that is also a change in the way we're discussing this topic, because in the past, there was always the emphasis on green is our growth strategy.
Yes,
green
exactly.
is our competitiveness. You are not finding that very much anymore in these discussions. So it does mean there is a shift in focus. And what I would actually expect is that, not very publicly, but that in effect, there's going to be a slowing down of the implementation of the green agenda, that it's not going to be pursued as vigorously, that it's not going to be implemented and enforced as vigorously as maybe before was the case.
Janis?
Well, I think that, first of all, I agree with Fabian. However, I think you can also see a shift in the rhetoric and the narrative which is being transmitted. And there are good reasons, by the way, to do so. Let me explain what I mean. The economic effects of climate change, of a loss of biodiversity, so the effects on our economies, the effects on future growth, or the loss of growth, or negative growth because of the effects of climate change, are increasingly being put in center stage in the argument. So the argument is no longer, if we concentrate on green, that will increase our competitiveness, it will make us economically more stronger. But the argument becomes, the effects of climate change are showing themselves, and potentially, and the loss of biodiversity, it's not only climate change, are showing themselves faster than we thought, and thereby we mean economic and societal effects, and we need to react to this, and we need to do so because there are economic pressures. So there is a different link which is being made, which is interesting in the narrative. But Fabian is right in terms of, their overall level of ambition, which is now more in the implementation logic, fearing that potentially there might be a backtrack, but then explaining that backtrack would be harming, not only because of the effects on climate, but also because of the effects on the economy and societal developments, and also trying to persuade industry and economic actors that this is a logic which they should adhere to.
And
And here
again,
you have differences of opinion.
And again, that link to public opinion, the reference, the focus in agriculture on a competitive, sustainable, resilient agricultural sector, very much because of what we've seen from the demonstrations by farmers, their sense that the Green Deal is a lose-lose for them, not a win-win. And again, that perhaps linking to the European election agenda, something we'll come back to next time. But I want to drill, you said earlier, they picked this area partly because broadly, there is agreement on the competitiveness agenda. And then I think Fabian said earlier, it's not the overall challenges, it's once you get concrete, and CMU discussion illustrating this, that's when it gets difficult. So just in terms of what actually happened at the summit, Janis, bring us up to speed in terms of the conclusions, once again, underline how important this is to unlock private capital, but we didn't seem to get very far, and there's a fierce argument going on. What's the argument about, and can it be resolved?
Well, first of all, because you were asking what actually happened at the summit, it started with a report from Letta about his report. So he introduced the main elements of what he's asking for. Well, by the way, as I said earlier, highlighting that it's a toolkit. His words. It's not a Bible, it's a toolkit. It's very pragmatic. You can take whatever you want out of it. There are certain things which you can do faster, other things that might take longer. And by the way, just to say, he also said, and there's nothing on treaty change in this report. So to take away these worries.
Yeah.
And by the way, you can watch,
but
you can watch what he said to the heads of state and government because it is available online. And then he brought forward what his ideas are with respect to the leftovers of the Delors period when it comes to the single market, highlighting energy, telecommunication, and financial markets. He spoke about a fifth freedom, which he thinks is necessary when it comes to enhancing research, innovation, education. So he laid out what he thinks are the main elements that should be pursued and are reflected in the report. And then they had in some 2 hours discussion about the report and with Letta about what he had presented. But then actually they came to the core of the matter, which was that they wanted to have a discussion about capital markets union.
Can I just hold you there for a moment? Let's just stick with the single market part first, and then we'll come to this capital markets union.
Yes.
Just in terms of the reaction to the report and the clues, they're now talking about having, and I quote, a horizontal strategy for a modernized single market by June 2025. Fabian,
Yes.
your sense of what that might include. And can I just, I asked you at the beginning, why didn't they talk about defence first at this summit? And one of our audience, Andreas, I'm going to mess up this surname, I am absolutely sure, Aktudianakis, who links the two, because he says, Letters report captures areas we are yet to deliver on in Europe. And the issue he tackles about the single market have been known for some time before the current deterioration in the geopolitical order. What do you think would be the impact of our putting our economies on a military footing in the coming years? Would we still be able to address Letters' key issues and the need to boost defence posture? So making a very interesting link on the topics there. But Fabian, in terms of react to that, please, if you wish, and your sense of where this discussion is going based on the reaction to the Letter report.
It's not the first time. We have had a number of attempts of a more horizontal approach to the imperfections in the single market, which persist ever since 1992, really, because there have always been areas where the single market hasn't functioned properly. And if anything, at this moment in time, there's a real pressure on the single market, which comes from external developments, but also comes from internal developments, if we look at subsidies, for example. So the wish to have a horizontal approach, the wish to fully utilize the asset of the single market, to help our competitiveness, to help us to achieve the goals which we have with the twin transition, etc. That is a very old ambition. And the question is going to be, and I don't mean this in any way as a disrespectful letter, I think it's a very good report, but there isn't, in my view, there isn't very much new in it. It is actually about a number of things we've known for a very, very long time. And the problem, as always, is do member states actually have the political will to make package deals where they are overcoming their taboos in their particular field, where they have problems with the idea of further integration, where they have problems with the idea of the single market working better than it does at the moment. So it's great to have these reports. It's great to have a strategy. But the politics of this are incredibly tricky. And that we did see on the one issue where they did go a bit more concrete, the Capital Markets Union.
Which I'll come back to in a moment. Janis, your reaction to that, and also to this question of, is there a discussion now more? We hear increasing warnings about the situation, more and more talk of, are we on the brink of a third world war? Is there a serious discussion in capitals, between capitals, about putting Europe's economy on a sort of military footing?
I'm just not sure that there is a serious discussion about putting it on a military footing, and I'm not sure that this would be the right way. I think what you actually need is that you need a stronger emphasis on cooperation among member states when it comes to the defense sector. And obviously that has a strong industrial, economic perspective to it, and it has also a very strong geopolitical reason of why to do so. So there is more of a discussion, there is more of a momentum, but actually, if you then see what is happening on the ground, since the German Chancellor spoke of Zeitenwende, we now speak of global Zeitenwende, European Zeitenwende. There is more of emphasis in declarations, but if you look into actual developments, the EDA will tell you that in terms of cooperation, and that's the European Defence Agency, so it's a European and EU agency, itself says the level of cooperation when it comes to in the defence sector between member states is marginal, and it is marginal. If you look into the numbers, it's nothing compared to the needs. If you look into national defence developments, defence sector developments, you also see that there is not a lot of one investment, and there's a lot of investment in non-European things, and the Americans are happy about us buying defense products from their defense industries. So there is more of an emphasis. There is a discrepancy between declarations and the actual realities. And on the things we do, I think we often are not ambitious enough and potentially also moving in the wrong direction. So let's see how this will be balanced out. But don't forget, also Draghi will come back to this.
Indeed. Just to throw in, I know you want to come back in, but Emmanuel Jakob comment really says the essential problem is that the vast majority of the security and defence discussion is mainly conducted around the industry aspect and not around the decades-long problem of a European defence union community. You have, of course, at the EPC you are launching at the end of this month a new project on security and defence, reflecting how important this issue now. Just wanted to throw that into the mix. But Fabian, you wanted to react to what Janis said.
Sorry.
Just more generally on defense and security. And here I'm very much talking about the economic aspects of this at the moment, not the wider political question, which has just been raised. But on the economic question, it is astonishing that, at face value at least, that when we are having these discussions around competitiveness, that defense and security is not far more prominent in those discussions, because that's where we're going to spend an enormous amount of money in the next years. And that is also where the investment is going to go, the public investment, which is going to be missing in other areas. We are going to be forced to find ways of, and this should be one of the key themes of these discussions, if we want to have the technology and the green transition, which we're talking about, we will have to become far more effective in getting private money into these kind of transitions, because the public money is going to be very much
which links us very neatly into the conversation about capital markets union and unlocking private capital. Janis, very quickly on react. I know you want to react to what Fabian said. I want to move on to the CMU after that.
When it comes to defense union, defense community, which was mentioned, we're not at all moving in that direction. There is more an inclination to say this is not what the EU is about, this is what NATO is about, and there are different reasons and there are different motivations to say so. So we're not moving in this direction. When it comes to defense sector and cooperation in defense sector and putting money into it, as I said, expect more coming from Draghi in this direction, but it is something which is not popular. Because this then shows, if you have a discussion about should you invest into defense, that in other areas you will be able to invest less. And this is the difficult discussion we're going to have. The question is, what happens after the EP election? Because we're pushing it aside, because we do not want to have that difficult one. Because if you look into what people want, what citizens, what they will tell you, we're worried about our jobs, we're worried about social security, blah, blah, blah. And so they want to avoid having this discussion. The question is whether once we get over the European Parliament elections, under the umbrella of competitiveness, we will see that then.
We've still got lots of ground to cover, so I'm going to have to move on swiftly. Capital Markets Union, Janis, tell us what happened at the summit, what the central issue, what the argument is about, and whether it's likely to be resolved.
So after they had the discussion with Letta, who, by the way, was saying, don't call it Capital Markets Union, call it Savings and Investment Union, they discussed the Capital Markets Union. And this was, Fabian already indicated it with respect to something we discussed earlier, this was also the product of the fact that Paris and Berlin, Scholz and Macron were pushing when it comes to Capital Markets Union. The argument, the simplistic argument being made was that if you compare Europe to, for example, the US, our capital markets union is extremely weak. We need to unlock private capital. We need to lower financing costs. We need to have better access to capital for small and medium-sized enterprises, for startups. So all these arguments were raised with respect to capital markets union, and those two were pushing. And 10 were pushing back, led by the Irish and the Luxembourg. And Luxembourg, who do not want to go as far when it comes to capital markets union. By the way, referring to something, Fabian, you were mentioning earlier with respect to other issues, we have been discussing about capital markets union for years and years. And we've had in summit conclusions in the past words saying we need to move forward with respect to capital markets union. We ask finance ministers to do X, Y, Z. And then when it goes to the ministerial level, there has been no
Illustrating
progress.
exactly what you talked about at the beginning of this event.
So now you had the French and the Germans pushing, Scholz
Yep.
and Macron pushing, others pushing back. And if you look into the summit conclusions, you will see that the wording of the summit conclusion is mirroring these differences between member states. To give an example, it says that the European Supervisory Authority should supervise the most systemic relevant cross-border capital and financial market, most systemic relevant to be defined. And for another example, harmonizing relevant aspects of national corporate insolvency frameworks, relevant aspects still to be defined.
Gotcha.
So there's pressure from the Germans and the French. Others are opposing, and that is mirrored in the European Council conclusions. And the question: what happens now at the finance minister level? And we've seen this story happening time and time again. And even the German side, by the way, I wonder whether the German government, the German finance minister will actually be doing what Scholz is saying in public should be done at the European level, or whether he will oppose that. So even there are question marks.
Thank you very much. Fabian, a comment to that, but also, can I just pick up on something in the conclusions, but very briefly referred to, refers to the need for, and I quote, an effective state aid and competition framework. And there is a lot of discussion at the moment about competition policy and the state aid framework, something also Letta has talked about. It's not there. There's no detail. Is that, even though there's this fierce debate, that's all there is? Is the reason why there's no detail precisely because of that fierce debate? Where is that going as well? So briefly on CMU to add to what Janis was saying, and then a word on that if you would.
When we look at both of these issues, I know I want to make a linkage between them. I think, yes, it is absolutely true. We've been talking about them for a very long time. Capital Markets Union is almost 10 years old now as a concept. We've had a number of actions in the meantime, including a 2020 CMU action plan. I mean, this is not something which is new. We have known that we need this. Similarly, we've known that what is happening on state aids at the moment is extremely detrimental for the single market. We are having huge amounts of state aids focused in a very small number of countries, in particularly Germany, but also France. And other countries have neither the willingness nor the ability to do the same thing. So these are issues which we know are on the table, but there's no agreement between the member states. And I would say there's no real appreciation that, given that the times have changed, that the priority should be far higher to actually get these kind of issues resolved. Because we are no longer able to, frankly, afford the luxury of not tackling these problems. We will need functioning capital markets to be able to have the transformations which we're talking about. And they are not functioning at the moment. And the Capital Markets Union is actually only one element of this. It is by far not the answer to all of these questions. It is just one step along the way. Similarly, we will have to have an answer to how do we deal with state aids. Not only state aids domestically, where we have a major problem, as I've just outlined, but also internationally, because we have the Inflation Reduction Act. We have other countries intervening much, much more into their economies. So I'm afraid, for me, this is really ducking the issue. It is about making a declaration about how desirable it would be if we made some progress, but let's see the progress before we say this is a good thing.
Okay, Janis, briefly on this, because I want to look ahead in a moment.
adding to what Fabian said,
Mm.
or first echoing, we need a capital markets union. There are a lot of strong arguments of why it makes sense to have one. And there are strong arguments and there are the right arguments. Having said that, I fear that we have the French who are pushing for the capital markets union because they think that this is something which will be in their national interests. And I think others are pushing for it because they want to avert us having a debate, which we actually also have to have. So I'm saying, not saying capital markets union is not something we need. We need it, obviously. But it could, and I think it seems to be, also one tactics behind it to avoid the debate about joint common borrowing. So what you will say is we agree that we need more of a capital markets union. We're now actually pushing it. It's becoming Chefsache. We need to think of how we use the EU budget in future. We need to involve the EIB more. And that's what we need in order to invest, find the financing, private and public, for the things we need to do. But push joint borrowing aside. So
and that
the
links
logic
very much to an overarching question about all of this I wanted to ask in terms of the debate about, are we willing, if we have this long shopping list, this Christmas tree effect we were talking about, all these different things we need to do, is there any sign that EU leaders are willing to, as it were, put their money where their mouth is in terms of the EU budget and this fierce debate about common borrowing? Janis, you feel this is an attempt to push that under the carpet?
Yes, I think that this is what we're doing. And look, you just need to look at what we had witnessed over the past months with respect to the debate about the midterm EU budget review. The Commission was asking for something, and we're not talking about huge amounts. We're talking about, well, there are big numbers, but compared to the challenges we're having, I don't think that the Commission was asking for something extraordinary. Mm. Member states were fighting back. We had coalitions. In the end, what came out was meager compared to what the Commission had asked for. And what we actually need in terms of financing needs at the European level, if we have, and once we have defined what our major European common goods are massively higher than what actually we're now discussing. So we will need something like joint borrowing, and we're not moving in that direction. On the opposite, I think what this debate is showing is that we're trying to make sure that we preclude this, take that off the agenda, like we do also in other fields. When it comes, for example, to treaty change, we don't want to discuss about that. So we push it aside.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to hurry you, but I want to look ahead now and see where we go. But 2 words, if you wanted to, on that, Fabian. And just a show now asking, I like this. He says, a typical Brussels bubble question. During the presentation of the ESPAS, standing for European Strategy and Policy Analysis System, Global Trends Foresight report on Monday, representatives of both Parliament and Commission said they hoped this report would be reflected in the strategic agenda. Is there any sign, is there any reference to that report or long-term foresight? This goes back to this long-term thinking about the challenges we have. Fabian, your reaction on this and this whole debate about common borrowing?
On common borrowing, fully agree with Janis. This is an attempt to get it off the agenda. But I would also say it's a futile attempt because we will get to the point where there's no other option anymore on the table. And that point is going to come at the latest when we are talking about the reconstruction of Ukraine, because countries are not going to put their hands in their pockets and find the money within their domestic budgets. So we are going to have to find these instruments, but by pretending that we can push them off the agenda, we're going to make that process much more difficult, much more badly governed, much more ineffective than it should be.
Do you think this is a pushing off till after the elections or a much longer kicking of the can down the road?
It's trying to push it off as long as you can.
Yeah.
But this is the continuous attempt of trying to avoid the unavoidable. And this is, in the end, not going to work. But on the strategic agenda and what we've called forethought, which goes a bit further than foresight, I think there is no indication whatsoever that our leaders are having the strategic discussions which should be taking place at the moment. And we have said this many times on the update as well. What we need at this moment in time, and we need it now as we have needed it for the last 2 years, is a cross-border discussion around what are our strategic objectives? What is it we have to reach over the next years? And then we should be talking about what are the concrete policies we're going to put around it, prioritizing, but also recognizing the trade-offs that something has to give when you have that kind of priority.
Thank you. Thank you.
But this is not happening.
2 words, if you would, Janis, before we say where do we go from here, both on the strategic agenda and linking this. I know you wanted to talk treaty reform earlier and I stopped you, but linking this to the discussion about internal reform, just in terms of the Franco-German relationship, a very quick reply, if you would. Should we be reading this seeming, you raised a question mark over the German position on CMU, but this seeming alignment more than we've seen recently on Ukraine, on the CMU, is this the French and Germans beginning to sort of recognizing the damage their lack of leadership, their lack of agreement is doing to the EU, or are we reading too much into it if we say that?
I think it's reading too much into it, because the reasons why there's a problem between the Franco-German relationship, why the engine isn't functioning. By the way, the engine in itself would not be strong enough in itself. So you would also need to have others on board. But pushing that aside, the reasons for that go deep, they're structural, and they encompass a lot of major strategic questions where there are differences between Paris and Berlin. It's not 1 or 2, it's a number of issues where they have differences of opinion that makes it difficult to find an agreement on 1 or 2 things which they consider to be significant. So these are, I think, singular cases like the Capital Markets Union, where you saw that they came together. And let's not forget there's also a personal dimension. Macron and Scholz are having problems with each other, but they're hearing what is being said. They hear the signs, the worrisome signs, and indications coming from the outside saying you need to get your act together. So they feel these pressures. So when they have an opportunity, they do so. But this is more ad hoc. I don't think that this is something which is structural.
Okay. Where do we go from here? What are the next steps to develop the strategic agenda? And is there any discussion? It doesn't seem to have been at this summit, but do you see this process of also discussing the internal reforms needed to deliver on it? Are we getting anywhere on that? Couple of minutes each. Janis first, and then I'll give Fabian the last word.
Well, with respect to the process, Michel is having talks, individual with EU leaders, but there are also group discussions which they're organizing and having. So the ball is moving. The question is, what will come out of it, what the level of ambition will be. But in the end, we will have a strategic agenda. So that is clear. We will get it in June. We see also when Draghi will come with his report. I advise everyone to read a speech he gave earlier this week at a conference on the European Pillar of Social Rights, where he outlined some of the key elements of his report, not the details, but the outline that shows you that he will be pushing. Let's see how that will influence the debate, probably after the EP elections. And when it comes to internal reforms, yes, there is work being done on an internal reform roadmap. That's what it has been called technically. But I must say that I'm actually not very positive in terms of my analysis of what to expect. Even when it comes to, changes, governance, institutional changes within the Lisbon Treaty framework, we're having problems. Anything that goes beyond it is still anathema.
And not a real attempt to link these 2 discussions together. Fabian, a final thought from you in terms of where we go from here and where we should be going.
I mean, not to repeat what Janis was saying, which I fully agree with. I think another element which we should be putting a lot more emphasis on is that what we should develop now is not separate agendas for the member states and for the Commission, but that actually Europe needs a common plan of how we're going to deal with things. So the question of how do we bring whatever Commission president we then have and that agenda together with this strategic agenda, and how do we also bring the people together to deliver this? It needs a common understanding of what is the scale and the scope of the challenges which we are facing, and then a common determination of how we're going to tackle them. But I'm saying a lot of things which are not going to happen.
But nevertheless, it is the job of a think tank to keep pushing for them and to do the work to help EU leaders get there, which the EPC does. And as I mentioned, there is an event at the end of the month on April the 30th, a conference to launch the EPC's new European Defence and Security project. Another event to draw your attention to this week, looking very much at some of these issues we've been focusing on today, a discussion paper on Towards a Competitive Edge, reforming the EU's regulatory framework, and also one on the European Parliament elections, on which has an intriguing title, Getting More Jitters from the Mainstream Than the Far Right. I'll leave you to look at the publication to see what that is all about. And linked to the competitiveness issue, there is also an event next Wednesday on reindustrializing Europe, where economic competitiveness and economic security converge. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be back with another EPC update on May the 2nd, where we will discuss the 2024 elections, potential outcomes and consequences in a lot more detail. So, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for a great discussion. Thank you to all of you, many of you who attended today. Thank you for your questions and comments. And may I wish you, even if you are in Brussels in this grey, rainy season that we appear to be having once again, may I wish you a safe, dry, and good weekend. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye.